Good evening, everyone. I'm Mr. Mitchell, Progress Leader for Key Stage 4. In this presentation, I'm going to be going through some general revision guidance for pupils in how to best prepare them for the GCSEs, as well as describing some specific revision strategies. Right then, before we get into our revision tips and strategies, I just wanted to first draw your attention to two really significant contributing factors to pupils' success in Year 11. Firstly, attendance. There's a really strong correlation between pupils' attendance and their success. You can see from the information on the slide that pupils with 97% attendance or above achieve a whopping 2 grades higher than those pupils with attendance less than 97%. The second huge contributor to success at Year 11 is the pupils' attitude for learning. This might sound common sense, but as you can see again from the information, that pupils with an average attitude to learning score of 5 or above, on average in 2019, achieved grades that are 2.3 grades higher than those with an attitude to learning score of below 5. This fact basically confirms what I always say to our students. Those pupils that show an absolute determination to succeed in the GCSEs nearly always do, and those that don't nearly always fall short of their potential. So the challenge for our students in Year 11 is, can you be in every day? And can you be in every day giving your absolute best? Right then, before we get into a few specific revision strategies that we would advise our pupils to incorporate, firstly, I just wanted to go through this list of general tips for our students in preparing well for the GCSEs. Tip number 1 would be advising you to plan your revision as early as possible. Okay, if you haven't started your revision yet, then you should have. Okay, so you need to start it as soon as you can. One thing we'd also advise is you create an actual revision timetable as well. Research shows that when pupils have created their own revision timetable, like the one displayed on the slide, they're significantly more likely to revise in terms of the actual volume of revision that they do and also the quality of revision they do. Pupils tend to feel well organised and feel reassured that they're actually covering all of the subjects evenly and fairly. And when it gets to, for example, 6 p.m. on a Tuesday evening and your revision timetable says that you're studying biology, research shows you're significantly more likely to actually revise that subject at that time because you feel almost duty bound to do so because that's what it says on your revision timetable you've created. There is a really good resource if you click on the link displayed there, getrevising.co.uk, which enables you to actually create your own study plan and revision timetable. It's colour coded, has the option to print it out so you can have your own copy, your parents can have a copy, and they can support you in sticking to that. Tip number 2 is to use revision techniques to help move information into your long-term memory. That's actually going to be the bulk of this presentation in the following slide, so we'll skip past that one onto tip number 3, which is to identify the subjects and the topics that you need to revise most. A common mistake that pupils often come across when they're revising is they actually focus the revision on the topics that they already feel knowledgeable in or already have a good understanding of. And what they should be doing is actually the opposite and trying to focus in on those topics or subjects that they have less understanding of or are less familiar in. Tip number 4 is to have well-organised revision resources. You're going to be studying and revising for up to 10 different subject areas, and it can get quite messy when you're trying to keep all those revision resources organised. What I would recommend is having a cardboard wallet style folder for each one of your subjects. Tip number 5 is to ensure you have a quiet, comfortable space to revise. Again, from experience, we'll speak to Year 11s year in, year out who complain that there's nowhere quiet at home to revise. So if this is you, you need to be proactive in addressing that as soon as you can. Tip number 6 is to get copies of the exam specifications for your different subjects. The reason for that is the exam specifications are a really good way of informing you exactly what will potentially be covered on your exam. And it's also a good way of checking, is there anything that you might have covered in lessons that won't be coming up on the exam. And what you can do with this exam specification is actually use it as a revision checklist. In a similar way, tip number 7, it's really good to have copies of past paper exams and also mark schemes as well. These, like the exam specifications, are available on the exam website. If you're unsure what the website is, or if you're unsure what your exam board is, then please check with your teacher and they will guide you to finding those things, but they're a really useful resource. Tip number 8 is to attend all revision sessions in school. In the upcoming weeks, we'll have a full programme of revision schedules after school taking place for all subjects. The teachers will be giving up their time, and it's dead important that you take full advantage of those revision sessions, because your teachers are the experts in preparing pupils for their exams, and like I said, you need to take full advantage of that and be attending them all. Final tip, tip number 9. When you're doing your revision, you want complete focus on what you're doing. If you've got complete focus, you're much more likely to actually remember the information that you're revising. The biggest single distraction to pupils when they're trying to revise is that mobile phone buzzing away in their pocket, which they then take out, have a little look about what it was, and suddenly the trail of thought is lost and the revision becomes much less effective. So turn the phone off completely for half an hour while you revise, and then you can stick it back on, check you've missed nothing, and then turn it off again and back to revision. So before we get into describing our recommended revision strategies, I just wanted to take a moment to explain the objective of these strategies and why we think they're so effective. If you take a look at the definition of learning in the centre of the screen there, learning is defined as an alteration in long-term memory. If nothing has been altered in long-term memory, then nothing has been learned. The revision strategies that we use, therefore, 6 months or more before our exam, need to be effective enough that not only can we recall this new information that we sit and revise in our revision sessions 10-15 minutes after the revision session, but this information needs to be so deeply embedded in our long-term memory that 6 months or more from now, we should be able to recall this information on cue should it come up in an exam. Okay, so we're going to focus on 3 particular revision strategies. Number 1, spaced practice. Number 2, transformation tasks. And number 3, retrieval practice. Spaced practice uses the theory that it's much more effective to spread your revision out over a number of days or even weeks, rather than sitting and revising in one continuous long session. The example given here is, if you had 5 hours to revise for one subject or one exam, the time would be much more effectively spent if you spread that 5 hours over 2 weeks with short intervals of revision, rather than revising the 5 hours the night before the exam. Committing new information to memory, as it says in the slide here, takes time and repetition. And therefore, in the last example, by spreading your 5 hours allocated time out over 2 weeks, what you're doing is giving yourself an opportunity to begin to forget information and then have to recall it, and then begin to forget information and then have to recall it. And this repetition and recall really helps new information get embedded in the long-term memory. Depends on when the exam is that you're revising for. Research actually suggests that there is an optimal gap in terms of the length of time that you should leave between revision sessions so that you can retain the information that you're learning. The table displayed shows the gap of days or weeks that you should leave in between your revision sessions, depending on how long you've got till your upcoming test. This is just a rough guide and it's not a fixed rule, but what it does underline is how ineffective it could be, for example, when preparing for your GCSEs a week before a history exam, dedicating a whole day to revising history. What would be way more effective would be in the months before your history exam, allocating time, perhaps once a week, doing a shorter session and having to recall that information each week and really get it embedded in your long-term memory. Effective revision strategy 2, transformation tasks. A really common mistake when it comes to revising is pupils simply reading through notes or maybe even copying out notes. Pupils can often kid themselves that they're doing loads of really good revision as they've written side after side on A4 paper of copied up notes. It's absolutely imperative that at regular intervals you're actually doing something with this information that you've read or these notes that you've written. The key thing to do here is to test yourself in some way. What have I actually learned from what I've read? You can do this by completing some of these transformation tasks that we're about to go through. It can be simple things like writing a summary of what you've just read. It could be producing flashcards based on the information that you've read, or it could be producing a mind map of a topic that you've just been reading through or writing notes upon. The big problem with simply reading over revision notes, or the big problem with simply copying out revision notes, is that the information that you're trying to revise just doesn't tend to stick. And that's the key objective is revision, is to make it stick. This slide gives you some more transformation task ideas. Take the third column, for example, reduce it. If you've just been revising a certain topic, then can you reduce that revision material into some key bullet points? Or if you've been revising some important facts in a revision topic, can you reduce that into some key words? By actually having to transform the information that you've been revising into a different format, forces you to engage with the content more deeply, and this is conducive to helping you remembering this stuff in future. Take a look at the fourth column, test it. It's crucial that if you've been reading through a revision topic, that at some stage you actually test what information you've learned and what can you remember from the topic you've just been revising. You can do this by creating flashcards, using past papers, or even creating your own quizzes. But the process of testing yourself and having to recall this information, again, helps to embed that in your long-term memory and helps you to recall this information in future. The next revision strategy is retrieval practice. The idea here is that if a piece of information is retrieved from your brain enough times, then eventually it will become embedded in your long-term memory. I'm going to give you a practical example of this. I'm going to give you a maths sum, and I want you to try and answer the question or the answer to the sum as quickly as you possibly can. You ready? No pressure. What is 5 times 5? Now, I've got the right answer, it's 25. Okay, quite an easy question. But the interesting thing here is how many of you actually worked that out? How many of you went, well, 5 with 5 is 10, another 5 is 15, another 5 is 28, and another fifth 5 makes it 25? Or how many of you just simply know that 5 times 5 is 25? And the reason you know that is because in your past, you've had to retrieve that information enough times that you now just simply know it. It is firmly rooted in your long-term memory. And that is the objective of retrieval practice. We want things, new information that we're getting from our lessons or from our revision sessions that we're doing independently. We want that new information to be embedded in our long-term memory, just as your 5 times 5 sum is for you. So retrieval practice then can take different formats, but the most common format is what we call low stakes quizzing, which is basically you using a bank of questions which challenges your brain basically to retrieve information. And you're doing this regularly, and the more often your brain is challenged to retrieve this information, the more common this information becomes to you, and the more you feel that it's embedded and you've actually learned this information and you can recall it when you are required to. So you probably know what flashcards are, but they're a really effective method of revision because they use this theory of repetition and retrieval. The normal format is to have a question on one side and an answer on the other side, or they could have maybe a keyword on one side and then the definition, because a lot of subjects require you to learn definitions. So you could have a definition on, the keyword on one side, and then on the back of that would be the definition of that keyword. If you've got a pack of these that you've created for each subject, or maybe each topic within a subject, you can literally sit there repeatedly testing yourself on these questions. And like we've said before, if you do that and combine this with space practice, so you're doing a pack for each subject maybe once a week, and then so half an hour on geography flashcards, and then you leave it another week, spend another half an hour on these geography flashcards. What you're doing is you're combining this retrieval practice with space practicing, and your revision is doubly effective. So retrieval practice then doesn't just have to be through the use of flashcards. Retrieval practice can be done through using pictures, using concept maps, or even using tests. You can produce your own sets of questions and do it in that format rather than flashcards, or you can use sets of questions that other people have produced. So for example, it could be your peers, it could be your teachers quite commonly, or it could even be sets of questions that are in a revision guide. Whichever format you use, the rationale remains the same. If you're regularly having to retrieve this information that you're revising, then come exam time, you're much more likely to have this information at your disposal. If when doing your retrieval practice, you can actually produce pictures to go alongside your revision notes, this can be a really effective way of revising too. We call this dual coding, but if you've got a certain image that you've produced that goes with a piece of information, and therefore that information goes with a picture, having those two bits of information which relate to each other helps the information embed in your memory. For example, you might be doing a topic on history, and you're doing a timeline of events that led up to the Second World War. If you can do this timeline with the key bits of information, but actually have it annotated with images that you've created, it can really help when you're trying to recall that information and retrieve that information in the exam, to have this image which is associated with the information and the information that's associated with the image. You can picture the images, which helps trigger the information which you can then recall in the exam. Okay then, so just a quick recap of the revision strategies that we've been through. Number one, space practice, plan, not cram. So this idea that if you've allocated a certain number of hours to revise a topic or a subject, it's much more effective to do smaller sessions of revision, but actually space them out over time. So maybe do them weekly or even fortnightly in the lead up to your exams in May and June, but you need to start that now, don't you, and have that plan in place. Number two, really effective strategy is to transform the material that you're revising. So it's far less effective to simply read over stuff, or to simply copy out notes, or to highlight things that you're reading. It's much more effective if you can do something with that material. For example, transform it into some form of diagram or picture or timeline or even a quiz. And that will be much more effective in trying to embed that information rather than simply glossing over it. And the third strategy, and arguably the most important, is retrieval practice. It's imperative that you're regularly quizzing yourself on the information that you're revising. Okay, you need to be honest with yourself and have an understanding of what do you actually know, what have you actually learned, and what are you yet to learn. I used the word before, metacognition, okay, and that is an awareness of the information that you've learned and the information that you're yet to learn. And by regularly quizzing yourself and regularly challenging your brain to retrieve information, you will get a really good understanding of the information that you know and the information you don't know. Okay, so that almost concludes our presentation on revision strategies. I hope you found at least some of that information useful. Remember, your subject teachers will be leading some of these revision strategies in their actual lessons to give you a bit of practice in doing the strategies, which then you can take into your independent study. Remember, both parents and pupils, if you do have any queries or are looking for some extra advice, maybe subject-specific advice, then please do contact the pupils' teachers by email, and they'll be more than happy to help. A very common question from pupils and parents at the start of Year 11 is, when should I start revising? Well, the simple answer to that is now. So the first thing I would recommend that you do is get your revision timetable in place, get it organised, and make sure you're allocating enough time on there to each subject, and then obviously you need to begin revising as soon as you can. Again, if you are having any trouble doing this, then please see myself or see your form tutor, and they will be able to advise and help you out. So all that remains is to say thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening.